right. I'd like to welcome everybody back again for this next installment of our biweekly webinar with North Texas Soccer. And this is one that I'm really excited about because, as Sam and I were talking about earlier, there's always that question that comes up in people's minds: is when do we teach skill within the current basis of whether play, practice, play, or through some of the other education platforms? And so when we're going through this and setting it up, this is one that I always had in mind that I really want to spend some time on. And so much so that we're actually going to break this up into the two different cycles of it, I guess you will. And so we'll start this week on this one, and then we'll do part two in 2 more weeks. But once again, Sam, thank you for joining on with us. And I sure appreciate you taking the time out of your time to be a part of our biweekly webinars once again. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Warren, and thank you once again for the opportunity. It's always fun to do these sessions and to have an opportunity to impact a number of coaches, not just in North Texas, but all across the country. That's one of the great things about a webinar like this, particularly since you're recording them, is that coaches can tap into it from anywhere at any time and continue their own development and education. So, coaches, as we go through here, if you have questions or comments that come to mind as I'm making the presentation, please write them into the chat, and then Warren and I will address those when we're done. So the first part will be a little bit of an information push, everybody, but we'll have a Q&A time at the end. And so questions come to mind, comments come to mind, go ahead and write those into the chat, and then we'll collect them and address them at the end. So here's what we're going to try to cover over the 2 parts, this today and then in a couple of weeks, just to give you an idea as to the direction that we're going on a number of different things. Here first, though, is the bottom line. Here it is in a real nutshell as to what skill acquisition for our purposes of soccer. This is it. And it really is, in the end, everybody, as simple as in an activity, in a training activity that you're conducting, teach ball skills at the same time that you're teaching tactics. So the example that I gave here is if you're running an activity that was a 4 versus 4 activity where you were working on the role of the first defender to be able to properly apply pressure. Well, one example of technique that would be involved in that activity would be tackling, block tackles, slide tackles, poke tackles, etc. There's a couple of other skills that would come into play for the first defender. The defender is putting pressure on the opponent with the ball in a training activity like 4v4. So it's just taking a look at, as you design your lesson plan and you think, okay, I'm going to run a session that's a tactical session on the role of the first defender and how to properly apply pressure. What are the relevant skills involved? Now, I chose this one as an example for this reason. When coaches teach defending, they have to realize that a lot of technique is not on the ball. So for first defender, an example of technique would be your posture to apply pressure. If you don't have a correct defensive stance, you're not going to be able to apply pressure correctly. But you don't have the ball. You're just applying pressure to the opponent who has the ball. So it's just recognizing that technique has a number of realms to it, a number of layers to it. So this is it, the bottom line. But here now we're gonna peel back the layers of the onion to see some of the reasoning behind it all. And before we dive into that deeply, I'm going to give you a moment to answer the 2 questions that you see on the screen, but keep this for yourself for right now. We're going to come back to these 2 questions later, but right now, just take a moment on a piece of paper on your desk, write it on your computer, whichever way you want to do it, but just answer the 2 questions for yourself that you see on the screen right now. Yeah, I'll give you just another moment, a little bit longer to answer those two questions. Make a few notes for yourself. All right. So keep those notes. Think about it a little bit as to what your answers are to these two questions as we go through, some of the information, and see how your thinking lines up with some of the information in regards to skill acquisition. To help set the table for us, here's a good philosophy from Dr. Torbert for us to think about overall as coaches, whether it be in a training session where we have a technique emphasis or a tactical emphasis, or doing a job of skill acquisition, which is a blend of the both, impacting fitness, technique, and tactics simultaneously in some game-like activities. But I think this way of thinking that you see in the quote from Dr. Torbert is a good one for us as coaches to recognize what's the environment that we're trying to achieve in a player-centered environment and with a holistic philosophy towards developing players. So to help us along, here's some definitions. I won't read all of this for you from the slide, just give you a chance to read it yourself as to a couple of quick definitions as to what is technique and what is skill, because while they are hand in glove, they are different. There are differences between them. So the big difference, as you can read on the slide, the skill is now the application of technique in a game situation, where you're having to deal with the opponent or opponents putting you under pressure when you're the player with the ball. You're having to do most everything on the move. You're having to do things very quickly. You're having to do things when you're on balance, off balance as a player. You may not always be in the best body posture, body shape as you try to do things with the ball because of that movement, because of that pressure from opposing players. And then as you read through the information on this slide, everyone, when you get down to the bottom where the two little blue arrows are, this again is a good general way of us to be thinking as coaches. That technique without tactics, without the application of them, it just becomes kickball. And tactics without technique is just kickball. And we're constantly, as coaches, trying to evolve our players and our teams out of basically a kickball approach to a more skillful and tactical approach as to how we play the game. But there's some information for you in regards to the definitions of technique and skill. Here it is straight from the dictionary. So this is just a Webster's Dictionary definition of technique. Give you a chance to read that. And then the photo gives us an indication of a player executing a technique, in this instance, an instep volley, but there's no opponent. She's on her own. She probably has unlimited space and no pressure from an opposing player. She might have done a little bit of movement. It might have been virtually almost no movement other than maybe a step forward for the plant foot to get in and then, strike the ball. But this isn't an example in the photo and a definition of technique. And here's one of skill, the definition of skill. And then you can see in this photo, the player is again getting ready to execute an instep drive, but is on the move. From the looks of both players, they're moving pretty fast. And for the player in blue, who's about to try to strike the ball for a shot, I would imagine that she's under pressure from an opposing player. So this is now the application of technique from some isolation, perhaps in some training sessions, to application in a game, and some of the difference in the definition between technique and skill. But as you can also read in the definition of skill here, there's more factors to take into account as you look at the last sentence on the slide on the right-hand side about what are some of the other environmental impacts that are affecting the player and affecting the choice of technique to use in different situations. So one of them, as an example, weather conditions. Here's one that I see unfortunately too often. On a windy day, players not accounting for that wind and making adjustments in the things that they do with the ball to adjust to that wind. One of the more common ones you'll see is there'll be a strong wind coming down the field, and a goalkeeper will still pump the ball into the wind. And on the other end of the field, the other goalkeeper not taking advantage of the wind coming from their back and going downfield towards their opponent's goal, and I'm being able to take advantage of that. So it's just thinking about those factors: field conditions, weather conditions, level of the opposition, et cetera, that impacts the choice of different skills and how you execute those skills during a game. So as we continue to peel back the layers of the onion as to what is skill acquisition, it's recognizing from a physical education perspective, motor learning and skill acquisition are largely one and the same. So we'll emphasize this a little bit more here in a moment, but one of the pieces to consider, particularly with young players, is that you need to be doing a lot of development of their athleticism at the same time that you're trying to impact their confidence and their comfort and their capabilities with the ball. So motor learning and skill acquisition, again, hand in hand, hand in glove, all of it going together. We'll hit on more of those ideas in a little bit more depth as we progress here. Here are some of the key aspects of skill acquisition. A lot of it has to do, and we'll talk about this more as we get into the pedagogy of coaching and some different approaches to be able to train players on ball skills, but that it's going to come across for you more when you're using game-like activities. So we can go back to our earlier 4 versus 4 activity as an example. In that, you're going to get the application of skill. And now let's just shift gears from the defending part of a player making tackles, correct defensive posture, and that sort of thing, and think about in a 4v4, let's look at passing and an attacking part. Well, now those passes in a 4v4 activity are going to require the players making the pass to make a lot of very quick judgments that affect how he or she passes the ball. It will affect which part of the foot they use. It will affect whether or not they pass on the ground or in the air, etc. So a couple of those factors are distance. What's the distance between me, the person with the ball, and my target? My target could be a teammate. It could be a space that I want to play the ball into for my teammate to run onto. It could be the goal. So I have to judge distance. Then I have to think about angle. What's my angle to that target person, that target object, that target space, just as a couple of examples. So when I'm in a more game-like activity, those factors constantly change. Just thinking about distance and angle in regards to passing or shooting. Those constant changes of angle and distance, those are things I have to be able to judge and then be able to adapt how I'm going to play the ball based on those factors. And that doesn't even take into account how much pressure am I under from an opposing player, what's the field condition, bumpy, dry, wet, slick, short grass, long grass, et cetera, right? a number of other factors that might be influencing, how I play the ball. So this is where the opportunity for learning is going to be deeper for the players, but it's harder for the coach to be able to help the players recognize those cues and to be able to, how do I adjust now? And then for the coach to be able to guide the player on what are some of the physical adjustments that you might need to make to adapt for distance, angle, field conditions, etc. So this is the foundation, physical literacy, as I mentioned just a moment ago, that we need to work on, particularly the younger players, but all players, but especially the youngest players, on their athleticism, their basis of athleticism, to then be able to control their bodies, to then be able to control the ball. So one of the things that we have to think about, particularly with very young players, is they need to learn how to manage themselves, their own coordination, their own balance, their own agility, etc. We need to work on that almost a little bit before we work on ball skills, before we work on technique, and then working on it simultaneously. So here's some of the information in regards to having a good foundation of physical literacy with young players. And part of that is going to be, as I mentioned, balance, agility, coordination. As you see in the second bullet point, proper running and jumping mechanics. This is, in fact, directly related to technique, not just the technique of running. You have to teach that. The technique of jumping, you have to teach that, but also teaching things that the players do with the ball. But I see the outcome with some of our older players that when they're young, they're elementary school age or even kindergarten age, they're not necessarily being taught correct running and jumping mechanics. And I mention this because it's not occurring in physical education class in school as often as it did a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations ago. So some of our kids are coming through with an inadequate amount of physical education at school. This means the coach, the soccer coach, and other youth coaches need to take on that responsibility a little bit more. So these are factors. In skill acquisition, you can see with the image and a little bit of the definition down there about power, where you see a young player striking the ball on a volley with an instep drive. And it's just taking into account all of the factors, all of the components of physical fitness, power, strength, flexibility, suppleness, agility, acceleration, balance, et cetera, all of these different factors of good athleticism. And then how do I teach those as a part of my physical literacy, which then will have a direct impact upon technique and skill with the ball. So here's some examples for when the kids are very young. We talk in the coaching courses about, particularly in the grassroots modules and the D license, we talk about the ABCs of physical literacy. We mention it, we work on it a little bit, but there's not always the time given the volume of information in the curricula of those courses to go in depth. So here's a little bit more information for you, as particularly if you're working with kids 6 and under, 8 and under, 10 and under, especially those age groups, as to some of the basic movement skills to teach them. So you need to be able to demonstrate these, have somebody else demonstrate them. All right, maybe we'll take swimming off of the list for the soccer field, but we need to teach kids how to run correctly, how to hop, how to skip, etc. All as a part of their body mechanics and control of their body. Back to the earlier comment of they have to be able to control themselves physically first before they can have a real effect with the ball. So I need to do some of these exercises without the ball. I need to do some of these exercises with the ball, and the kids improve on their physical literacy. Give you a chance to read the text to the left of the image.
clock's ticking. You have until I'm 7 years old to make sure I can do this, and this. Obviously, I can already do this then, because I get lots of help. Loads of kids don't and are really missing out. It's called physical literacy. And we need you to help us as early as possible, so we can do all kinds of things when we're older. We'll try anything at this age. So now's the time to help us, before it's too late. Because if we don't learn these basic skills now, we might just give up. We might never discover what we could have been good at, and we might turn into couch potatoes. So fire us up, inspire us. If you don't, you're asking us to settle for a life that's shorter and less healthy. And we don't want that, do we?
So this is back to, as I mentioned a moment ago, of us recognizing that a part of skill acquisition is physical literacy. That not all of skill acquisition is just things that the players do with the soccer ball. It's that basis of not just physical fitness, but the ABCs of physical literacy, in particular, agility, balance, coordination, as well as running mechanics, different ways of moving, jumping mechanics, proper landing to then, as they get older, to help avoid or reduce the chance of knee injuries, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things have a factor and are part of skill acquisition. So another piece of this for skill acquisition is us continuing to allow youngsters, particularly kids 12 and younger, to sample different sports. That they should not be confined or guided into playing just one sport prior to the age of 14 or 15. That an important part of skill acquisition is getting the opportunity to experience movement and tactical decisions, rules, emotional management, etc., in a couple of different sports, in addition to participating in youth soccer. But here you can see some information from Germany, research done at one of the universities there about players playing in the Bundesliga, which is the first division pro in Germany, and that a lot of the very top players in that league are ones who also, when they were children, played a number of different sports. They didn't confine themselves to just football, to just soccer. There came a point where that was obviously the main emphasis. And even when they were young and they might have been loving soccer the most, they were probably participating in other things. So some of that, everybody, could be sampling different sports, going and playing different sports, play a little bit of tennis, play some basketball in addition to soccer, etc. Could also be just different activities as a youngster, riding a bicycle, climbing a tree, doing these other physical movements that help to build their athleticism base, build their coordination, etc. And one of the things that we can also do to reduce in young youth players of overuse injuries, which has increased a lot, is to sample different sports and move in different ways, participate in different ways. That will help us with some of the overuse injuries that we're seeing with kids who, at too early of an age, are confining themselves to just one sport and doing those movements over and over and over and getting some overuse injuries as a consequence. But the broader message for us here is that sampling different sports actually improves our soccer players' athleticism, and it improves their abilities to be able to play the game of soccer both fitness-wise, technique-wise, and tactically. So here's a little bit more information for you as to the definition of sports sampling, what we're looking to do. And just as you read through this, I want to share with you another little possibility. Having the opportunity to work with a soccer organization in New York State. This soccer club has been in existence for about 30, 35 years at this point, and they're at a junction in the course of this club that they have made the decisions, and now they're working on how do we actually execute it business wise, curriculum wise, et cetera, to be a multi-sport organization. They're a soccer club that are going to add on other sports. They know the importance of sports sampling, but they want to be able to manage it so that they can manage the workload on players, et cetera, and be a multi-sport organization. So they're going to be predominantly a soccer club that will also have one or two, and maybe as the years go by, 3 or 4 additional sports alongside of soccer. In a lot of ways, it's very similar to what you see with a lot of different football clubs in Europe and South America, who football might be the main sport and the one that gets televised and the one that makes the most money, but it's not the only sport that that club does. They do other sports in addition to football, in addition to soccer. So there are a few clubs, soccer clubs in the United States that have already done this move, made this move to be a multi-sport club while being first and foremost a soccer club. And there's others that are in the process and thinking about how do we become a 21st century soccer club, sports organization, to be able to achieve this sports sampling, but keep soccer at the forefront with our players. So here's a little bit of information as I mentioned earlier. We would touch on the pedagogy a little bit of how we teach. And here first for you is a little bit of definition. And this linear approach is the way that most of us were probably, when we were young, were taught technique, were taught ball skills. Warren's nodding his head yes, that because I know he like me, this is how we were taught. And it's okay. It's what was known at the time. It was what was known in terms of the research, both in physical education and in sports, as to how do you coach. And the thought was, okay, I've got to take the technique out. I've got to work on the technique in isolation from tactics, and then try to plug it back into the game. And it just doesn't always work really well in terms of being able to plug it back in, because once you do the typical soccer drill, right, that a lot of us probably did when we were young in terms of learning how to pass, how to make a push pass. Coach would set up 2 cones 10 yards apart. Warren would stand at one cone, Sam would stand at the other. They would pass the ball back and forth to each other. I'd pass it to Warren, he would stop it, and then pass a stationary ball back to Sam, who would stop it, pass a stationary ball back to Warren. And so the ball was stationary. There was no opponent. We weren't moving as the players. We were standing still next to the ball and executing the pass. The angle was fixed already by the way the coach laid out the cones, and the distance was fixed. So Warren and Sam never got a chance to practice how to judge distance visually, how to judge angles visually, and then to make adjustments in how they pass the ball. So we learned the mechanics, right? But the going from that type of a drill setup and putting it into a 4v4 game or a full 11-a-side game did not always work really well. It worked, but not as well as what we need in terms of the application of skills. So it is this. I just described to you passing with a partner. You can see in the cartoon dribbling through cones. I was at a college showcase tournament this weekend, and I saw different teams in their warm-up routine, and the shooting a stationary ball was still going on as a part of the warm-up routine, even with these would have been high school age sophomores, juniors, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old kids, and a lot of that is still going on. But I've always thought this cartoon from Bill Hines does an excellent job of getting across what might be going through the heads of your players and the difference between a linear drill, like you see here in the cartoon, and then think about those same 4 kids that you see in the cartoon in a 4 versus 4 or 3 versus 3 or 2 versus 2 activity, and the impact on their dribbling in more realistic manners and more game-like situation. So here's the difference for us. Begin to realize that often we've tried to teach ball skills, technique, inside of a drill, as opposed to a game-like activity. And here are the differences between the standard drill and the standard game-like activity. So I'll give you a chance just to read that and contemplate on this information a little bit. If you have been through the coaching courses with your state soccer association in the last 10 years, maybe more, you'll know that the emphasis has been on creating game-like activities in our training environment to where the decisions that players are making, the application of their technique is more along the lines of skill, because they're taking in game cues. They're taking in game information that's helping them to make decisions about what's ball skill to use, how to apply it, etc. It looks a little messier on the surface, but it also has a better transfer of learning from the training session to game day, because it varies the factors on the players in a game-like activity are very similar to the factors that influence a player during a match. So the transfer of learning is better for the kids. But it is, coaches, it is harder to teach technique inside of a game-like activity because it's not as segmented, if you will, as you would find when you do it in a drill where things are done in a little bit more isolation. So here's another example for you as to some of you probably lived through this as players. Some of you probably did this exercise as a coach. I know I did, and when early on in my coaching, and sometimes it was teaching how to support, how to get a triangle. Sometimes it was teaching how to pass the ball or to receive the ball. But as you look at the diagram of the exercise, the drill, you see a couple of things that make it a drill and not a game-like activity. Again, for the players, both in regards to their passing and their off-the-ball run, the distance is fixed, the angle is fixed, and there's also no opposition. So once the players kind of learn the drill, learn the rules of the drill, all they have to remember is make sure the guy with the ball has somebody at either cone that he can play to them, okay, around the outside of the grid, right? So as you see here, player A passed the ball over to player B. That means player C's got to run to that other corner to be an option now for player B, okay? And these are the ways that they continue to move. So now player C has received the ball from player B. That means player A needs to make a run. So that's your run two that you see in the diagram. So all of that decision making for a player is after they've learned the pattern, which only will take just a few moments. Now all of that decision making is gone. Now they're on autopilot. They're not really having to think and read the game and make decisions. And the simple solution has been take those same 3 players, put them inside the grid that you see in the diagram. And now the 3 of you interpass the ball, make sure that there's always a triangle around the ball, make sure that the player with the ball has an option to the left and an option to the right, and then they're constantly changing inside the grid, their distance, their angles, and more decision making is going on. And eventually you would plop in a defender inside there, so they're playing 3v1, and it becomes much more game-like and much more demanding on their skills and their decision making, etc. This is another example, a couple of examples in the photos here. I know some of you lived through this as players. Some of you did this early on in your coaching. And again, for the coach, particularly the coach who's new to coaching, the coach who might be new to soccer, maybe doesn't have a soccer playing background, which is great. We still, as we continue to grow the game, everyone, we still need a lot of volunteer coaches. And this means we're absolutely going to get people who did not grow up playing the sport and have perhaps little experience in coaching any sport. But thank goodness they're out there and they're willing to volunteer their times and help out a group of kids to participate in the local soccer organization. Thank you for that. Now, for them to be able to recognize, in this case, dribbling skills, it's easier for them to do this kind of drill-like, have the kids in a line, skill in isolation, because then it's easier for them to recognize what's going on and be able to give the kids a pointer or two. But it takes away from the kids a lot of those variables in dribbling that they have to decide and execute in a more game-like situation. And as you can see in both photos, the kids towards the back of the lines are looking over the shoulders or around the kids in front of them, because they're basically not just assessing how well is the kid who's actually dribbling through the cones, how well is that kid doing. They're thinking about, man, hurry up, because I want my turn. They want to touch the ball. They want to get there and participate and not be waiting in these long lines. So you can see that it's an inefficient use of your time with the players, because you're not maximizing their contact time with the ball. So part of skill acquisition is going to be, in any way that you can, in a training session, increase their contact time with the ball. Then get them out of situations where they're having to wait for too long to take turns. And if you can eliminate that altogether, and everybody's participating, you set up everybody's in one big grid, you set up 2 medium-sized grids, you set up 3 small grids, so that everybody's participating all at the same time. That's maximizing your time during a training session to be able to increase the kids' contact time with the ball and their decision making, etc., which is a lot of what you see addressed in the sentence at the bottom in blue. And it's getting away from this more rote approach to learning in a more dynamic way to learning. So this is now going down that path of the more dynamic approach, less of a linear approach, and it's modifying games to be able to replicate game situations. So our example from the very beginning here today was the 4 versus 4 activity. And that's going to have a lot of game cues in it. It's going to have a lot of the principles of attacking and the principles of defending are going to occur in that situation, in that activity. There's going to be a lot of different ball skills. You could one day in that 4 versus 4, at one training session, you could focus on the defending part and the defending techniques and the defending tactics. Another day, you can come back to the exact same exercise and focus on the attacking techniques and the attacking tactics in that activity. So you have the chance to bring out more, in game-like activities than you could bring out in a drill, which tends to be things done in isolation and not a great use of your time with the players. So it's getting to this type of an image that you see in this training activity with the kids, of the yellows versus the grays versus the shirts, and it's more dynamic in nature. It's harder, particularly for a novice coach, to recognize if the technique went wrong, what a part about it went wrong, to be able to be more specific as the coach, to be able to give guidance to the player. Well, you contacted the wrong part of the ball. You were trying to dribble, and you got your foot too low on the ball, so that's why it popped up on you, and it got away from you a little bit. Or your touch on the ball was too strong, and that's why it got away from you. a number of different things that might go wrong in a dribbling technique. To be able to recognize that in a 4 versus 4 activity is just going to be harder for this coach to recognize it, to be able to give good guidance to the players. However, it's worth the extra work that needs to be done by the coach to be able to have the kids in these game-like situations where the situational learning is much, much closer to actual game day and then has a chance to show up on game day. So I won't go through this slide, and the next one has a lot of information. You'll be able to read through it when you look at the recording that Warren will post up in the North Texas YouTube channel. But it's just some more information for you in terms of what are some of the factors, variables that a coach needs to manipulate in a training environment in order to get away from technique being taught in isolation to be able to teach skill where you're working on the technique, but also the application of the technique. You're working in these game-like situations. And then here's the rest of some of that information in regards to our coaching approach to have a more skill acquisition training environment as opposed to a rote repetition of technique and drill-like environment, which that tends to be for a lot of coaches. That's the big shift. That's the big dynamic shift for a lot of our coaches because they were coached. You were coached when you were young. The odds are in a more drill-like and isolated sort of a fashion in regards to technique. And so that's our image that we start off with as coaches, is how to coach. When we first start coaching, we all tend to coach the way that we were coached when we were athletes. And it's just that the research continues to grow, and we have new information as to what are good ways, better ways for people to learn sports. And the game of soccer continues to evolve as well. So our coaching needs to continue to evolve as well. So here's some of the definition for you in regards to repetition. Because one of the things you'll hear in a lot of coaching education is the need for repetition. And it's absolutely true. But here's the difference between a couple of examples of repetition. You'll also hear rote repetition referred to sometimes, everybody, as static repetition or block repetition. And then random repetition is dynamic or variable repetition is also the way that it can be referred to. But you can see the definitions here that you see for both. You can see where on rote repetition, that's more like those drills that we showed of the kids dribbling through cones, etc. The random repetition of our example of a 4 versus 4 game-like activity is going to have a lot more variables that are going on in that environment. But you can also see, as you look over on the left under the column for rote repetition, that there is a positive effect from rote repetition. This is not to say, everybody, that it's a bad thing, that it actually hurts your players in development. It's simply that with that approach of rote repetition, the transfer of learning and application isn't as good to game day, and the positive growth does not last as long, is what the research is showing us. So the kid who does rote repetition can show some immediate improvement in his or her technique. But the application of that technique over time in games diminishes and diminishes and diminishes, and eventually gets to a sharp drop-off. So this is where you see down at the third bullet point where it says the learning curve flattens over time because the application in the training sessions isn't realistic to the sport. But there's still times, I think, for us coaches to do a little bit of rote repetition. That might be during a warm-up activity. Some of that depends upon the age group. Some of it depends upon what are the players, where is it in the schedule of things. So as in an example, over Saturday and Sunday, I took my 2018 to a tournament, and they played 3 games in 2 days. We don't have training today, but if we had training today, it would be a recovery training day. We would not do exercise activities where there's contact between the players. So it might be I might do some kind of isolated technique work where they're doing the body mechanics of a ball skill, but very little running, no physical contact, no 50-50 balls where they're challenging each other and all of that, as a part of their chance for their bodies to recuperate and recover. In fact, what I told them instead was take 3 days off to fully recover. Don't do any sports because they were really beat up and exhausted. And then we would probably get into a little bit of recovery day training. And then maybe after that, once they're ready, we'd get into regular training sessions and game-like activities. So here are principles of learning motor skills. There's these 5 points, these 5 principles. The next slide will have a few more. I won't go through each one in detail, give you a chance to read it a little bit. And again, you'll be able to look at the recording of this and pause it to be able to read these through in some detail. But one of the big ones for me on this page is the one that says the third one. It says principle of distributed practice. This is rather than trying to mass things into a 2-hour session and try to think that I'm going to learn a lot in a 2-hour session, can I perhaps do 3 1-hour sessions? That distributed practice on perhaps the same ball skill, the same tactics, has a better learning outcome when I approach that way. And then here's our final 4 principles of learning motor skills. The one that we're probably touching upon the most as you read this slide is the last one. And this is back to our difference between block practice, block repetition, rote repetition, random repetition, game-like activities. Okay. So the quote from John Maxwell that you see in yellow brings up for us, as you see the text below it, both in a training session or in a match. How do I take those situations, help players to recognize the ball skills, the techniques that they've used, how they can be improved? Often that learning opportunity, whether it's technique, skill, tactics, fitness, emotional management, etc., comes through a little bit more for us after a loss than after a win. But whether it's win, lose, or draw, there's learning from a game. There's learning that can take place. And if you are at a point where you're giving some emphasis to the kids on how to do a technique, a ball skill that's new to them, then taking it from that game, that last game that you played, and working with them on, we've been practicing how to receive the ball on the move because they're young 9-year-old, 10-year-old players, let's say, as an example, receiving the ball on the move. Well, we played a game, we've got maybe we have some recording, maybe we got some statistics, maybe we just have some information that we can share with the players in the next training session to continue to work on how to receive the ball on the move and how did we actually apply it, in a game. So it's this thought that as the coach, one of the things I need to assess during a match is how is the execution of skill going on? How is the transfer from our training sessions to our game? How is that showing up in the games? For our discussions today, it's the tactical application of technique. Am I recognizing which ball skills to use in different game situations, game moments, and making those types of decisions, which are often married to the situation, the tactical situation. So I like this from the KNVB is the Football Association for the Netherlands. Obviously, the Netherlands, despite their small size as a country, is a heavyweight on the international level of playing the game of football in World Cups and other international competitions. They have an outstanding professional league. They develop players that play professionally in many different leagues. So here's Bert Van Linnigan is no longer their technical director for the association, but when he was, this is an interesting quote from him, and this came through in their coaching philosophy as to what they taught in their coaching education courses and how they were looking for coaches all across the Netherlands to develop players. And it's recognizing that ball skill in a game is never exactly the same way 2 times in a row. So it's that old bit that some of you probably heard previously as an example. When you pass the ball in a game, no 2 passes are identical. The ball is going to be bouncing, rolling away from you, towards you, across you, in the air, spinning. The variables that go on and on about how you actually physically pass the ball change between every pass that you make in a game. So no 2 passes that an individual player makes are identical to one another during a game, because all of these constantly changing variables, and there's a long list of variables that influence all of this. So this is another example for us as to why we need to use more game-like activities and the teaching of ball skills in training sessions. Questions, comments? Here at the end of part 1.
I was kind of just coming to think of it, and I know you've done a lot of the coaching courses, but what is the biggest thing you see that, especially at the grassroots level, that people sometimes feel leery about this? Because I know you talked about some a little bit, but I know just in some things I've seen, but you've probably seen a whole lot more in mine. What is the biggest wall blocker that you would think of?
The biggest one for a lot of coaches is just mindset, their mindset, because they're kind of locked into, it's opening their minds, but they've gotten themselves locked into somehow or another. It's impossible in their way of thinking to teach technique without doing it in isolation, without doing some of the rote repetition. And I tell them there is some value to that. It's not that it's worthless and we want to throw it out 100%. It has an application, particularly with older players in a club soccer environment where they're playing for 8, 9, 10 months out of the year. I have to now also think about the management of workloads on players. So I can't use game-like activities in every single training session, because game-like activities have a physical load on the players, or can be physically demanding. So I have to think about that. That's coaches also thinking about for themselves, just getting out of the past. It's getting out of their own past. The odds are, Warren, the way that they were coached, the way that they started coaching. They've seen that they've had some success with that way of coaching, and now they're reluctant to making an adjustment because they think, well, I've been quite successful. Why would I change it? And it's just polishing it up. It's getting it better. It's taking it to another level. And then for some coaches, we're back to the more novice coach and their abilities to be able to recognize the skills inside of a game-like activity and to visually pull that out in their minds, in the coach's mind, to be able to then give the players some guidance and to recognize in a game-like activity if there was a breakdown in the activity. Was it a technical breakdown or was it a tactical breakdown? There are a lot of coaches that have a hard time distinguishing between the two. Was it a fitness breakdown as opposed to a tactical breakdown or a technique breakdown? Or was it a technique breakdown that caused a tactical breakdown? Was it a fitness or physical literacy factor that caused the technique breakdown? And so it takes training, study, and visual skills on the part of the coach to be able to look at a game-like activity where there's a lot of different things happening all at the same time, and then to be able to pull out for an individual player a piece of technique that you can give some guidance to that player. And I said, Warren, at the beginning of this answer that perhaps is more clearly the novice coach. But I've seen, whether they're novice or not, I've seen coaches who have a strong playing background. Some of them ex-pros. They can do the skill, but to be able to break down the skill and be able to teach it to somebody else, that's a whole nother skill set for a coach. So I've seen coaches who they themselves can execute the skill, but they can't necessarily, or they have to struggle to teach it to others.
Well, sometimes too, I wonder, just in the experience I've had is a lot of times is that people feel uncomfortable putting kids into a game from the very get-go. Because like you said, based on past experience, you always had some kind of line drill that you did when you were 5 and over. And so you get an idea mentally that training a sport or a game or like soccer, you have to follow this certain drill mentality rather than, kind of letting go of it and letting the game kind of teach and get the kids to get experience in it as well. And that's something that, that as we do the grassroots stuff here in North Texas, try to get that through to coaches to understand that the game is the beauty. Just build a game and let the kids figure it out, because it's the input and the self-determination of technique applied is more valuable than just when to pass the ball or how to pass the ball. And that's the beauty of soccer itself.
And I think there's several different factors influencing that mentality, that approach, that environment that you're describing to us. One is a lot of coaches feel like if I'm not doing some of these more drill-like technique work, the parents on the side think that coaching's not taking place. Because to those 100%. Parents, that's how they envision, how coaching should be, what coaching is, and how their kids should learn ball skills. Whether they were an athlete or not an athlete, it's just, how they envision it. So some of it is the parents on the sides, and then maybe some negative feedback the coach might get because the parent doesn't see these somewhat isolated, dribbling through cones, passing back and forth in stationary positions, approach to teaching ball skills. Another part of it is we as a soccer nation have evolved a great deal. So for me, getting exposed to playing soccer for the first time ever in 1970, 1968, 69, 70, right? There was no soccer on TV. There were no pro teams, not in Central Florida where I grew up. Okay? There was one college team. I didn't know it existed, at 15 years of age. Okay? And, there wasn't any report on the soccer game in the newspaper. There wasn't any footage on the local TV, sports segment of the nightly news. Okay, so there were maybe 5 to 7 minutes of highlights from the 1970 World Cup on the old Wide World of Sports on ABC. And that was basically, just the highlight reel, right? A few goals. And we didn't see anything else. So coaches had to help kids who had never played soccer before, never seen a soccer game before, and and the coach had never played soccer before, never seen a soccer game. That was our situation. And the coach was trying to teach them ball skills. So to break it down into this very drill-like approach, work on those body mechanics, was a necessity for those coaches and players 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 30 years ago. But in the last 50 years, look how much we have evolved as a soccer nation. Look at the amount of soccer that the kids today could choose to watch. They have it
Oh,
all
no,
the time. They have it on TV. If they live in your case, if they live in Dallas, they can go watch FCB live, right? They can watch college games live. There's high school soccer in every high school, right? You know,
Right.
there's obviously lots and lots of club teams. There are adult amateur teams that you go watch their parents play, right? And so on and so on. So the kids' exposure to the sport and seeing good players execute ball skills, etc., that's visually there now to have a visual imprint on the player. This means that the kids already have some notion in their minds as to how particular ball skills are done because they've seen it done by older players. So we coaches need to recognize that that's going on. In fact, encourage the players to go watch older players play. But we can now approach how we teach ball skills, how we teach technique differently, because our soccer environment is so much different than it was years ago.
That's an excellent point. Hey, you did have a shout out by Stephanie. I don't know if you read that in the chat, but she said, I found this information valuable. You've opened my eyes to training in a different style. Thanks, Sam. So thanks, Stephanie, for that input.
I appreciate
Does anybody else have any questions anywhere within the group before we close it off? And then we'll have, obviously I was gonna, if you don't mind putting down, because I'm kind of interested. We got Utah Soccer in here, and you know, we had Thomas from South Dakota. I wonder if you'll put where your location is within the chat too, just out of selfish interest. But it is pretty neat. We've had people all over the country, like you said, to your point, that have been popping in. I think we had somebody from New York last time, so it's actually kind of heartwarming to see that we're getting pretty good recognition outside within the country for the stuff that you're doing and taking the time out to be a part of this. And so, yeah, another North Dakota. There you go. So it's really, like I said, it means a lot, and I'm glad you guys are taking the time to come in and do it.
My pleasure.
There you go.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I'm glad.
I would imagine, Warren, that I don't know that there is a way to be able to collect the info, but I wouldn't be surprised that on your YouTube recordings that you have of these webinars, that you're having people from not only all over the U.S. and not only all over Texas, but you know, from other parts of the world, perhaps taking a look.
Oh, that'd be fun. So
what you're doing, I think, is a great complement to coaching education.
well, I think actually it's based on you. I mean, you're the one that brought the information today. So once again, this is something that I've really had a passion for, and just to supplement our coaching education stuff. And I think today was an excellent example of that. And I'm really looking forward to December 18th. You know, so I know this is kind of like a snack for the meal that's to come.
Right.
And so with that being said, I appreciate everybody coming in and appreciate you taking your time to be a part of our webinar series. And as always, look forward to it. I know we've got some neat things we're going to try. I think come in January, we're actually going to try a Spanish version of this. So having this webinar series be totally in Spanish. So we're going to try that with Javier, who's here in the office, and then start off with some different personalities as well. And if you guys have within whether it's on the YouTube channel or here, if you'll just drop me an email at warren@nortexas or ntxsoccer.org on suggestions or recommendations, and we'll look at that too. And with that being said, I'll close it out for this round and look forward to seeing everybody on December 18th. Thanks once again, Sam.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you, everyone. Take care.